pals, I'm here today to do one of my favourite videos to film of the year, and that is to talk about the books I plan to read in the colder and cosier months. Rather than just making this be an autumn TBR, I thought I would make it my autumn and winter TBR because I tend to read the same type of books across both of those seasons. I feel myself saving a lot of the books I really want to read for this time of the year because I like to read a lot of sort of atmospheric books, a lot of historical fiction, and I tend to associate those type of things with the darker, colder evenings. This is the first day I've been able to wear long sleeves in a while. This is also the first day I've needed to use my studio lights, so I hope the lighting is okay. I can't wait for all the leaves to change colour and the air to smell wonderful and all the amazing flavours and scents to come back, and to be able to wear cosy clothes and just all the autumnal and winter things. I love it. And I know lots of people don't really love winter after Christmas has happened. I'm still in my element at that time of year. So yeah, I have 21 books to talk about, 9 of them are historical fiction. So that's giving you a hint as to the type of books I feel suit the autumn and winter. Although I should say specifically historical fiction set in, I think all of these are set in the UK. So I considered putting the historical fiction books in chronological order in terms of when they're set, but then I couldn't really be bothered. So these are just in a random order as they appear on my list. One thing I'll say about a lot of the books on this list is that I haven't counted, but I think over half of these books are from authors who I've previously read books by and loved. And so I've been really excited to get back to their books, and just felt for quite a few of them that I wanted to save them until the colder months. So I'm very excited to be able to read them. So the first book I have is Falling Angels by Tracy Chevalier. I have read a single thread by this author. I listened to it on audio when it came out a few years ago and I really enjoyed it. And I've also read Remarkable Creatures, which I didn't enjoy anywhere near as much, but still had that real sense of sort of cosy atmosphere to it. And so I had a look through all of Tracy Chevalier's books, and the one I'm most excited about, and this one's got really good reviews, is Falling Angels. This is set in 1901 in London. Quite a few of these books are set in London. And we follow these 2 different families who, just after Queen Victoria passes, they are visiting neighbouring graves in a London cemetery. And their 2 young daughters befriend one another, which one of the family aren't very keen on because these 2 families are very different. One of the families is very progressive and one of the families is very traditional. And then we follow these 2 girls who become women and their friendship through the following years as lots of changes come to London. Things like cars are replacing horses, electric lighting is taking over from gas, and emancipation is fast approaching. I love following coming of age stories, particularly about young girls, and I also love following stories of female friendship. So I'm excited for this one. It's over 400 pages long, which is also something I enjoy in the colder months. I just like getting stuck into longer books. So I have high hopes for this one, and I may audiobook it. I will need to look into the audiobook narrator. This next one nearly missed my list, and that is because it's by Emma Donoghue. And I find she has new books out quite regularly. This is her newest book, but I find that I'm either really interested in the premises of her books or not very interested. The ones I tend to be really interested in are the ones that are set in the UK, but she has quite a few books that are set in like warmer countries in Europe, I think, and I haven't been as interested in those. But this one sounds really good. This is also about 2 young girls who meet and grow up together. This one opens in 1805 at a boarding school in York when 2 14-year-old girls meet, and those 14-year-old girls happen to be Anne Lister and Eliza Raine. And then we follow their romance and their lives together. I was reading reviews of this one, both positive and negative, and even in the negative reviews, the criticism people had was that this was really minutely focused on their life at the boarding school and was very slow, and that makes me feel really excited. I love sort of campus school novels, but in particular, I love books set in a boarding school, so I'm more than happy to hear about the minutiae of that life. So again, excited for this one. May check it out on audio. That might be the case with a lot of these books because I find historical fiction really works on audio for me because people tended to speak differently. So it's always good to have a an idea of how people would have spoke in that time. The next one I think a lot of people will be reading because this has just come out and it is a massive release, and that is The Fraud by Zadie Smith. I have requested this one at my library. I think I'm now 7th in the queue, so I probably need to wait a few more weeks for this one. I will probably read this one because Zadie Smith is an incredibly intelligent writer, and when I'm reading books from writers who are very precise in their language and also, you know, are fairly intellectual, I like to see the words on the page. This is also over 400 pages. This is based on a real life trial called the Tichborne trial that took place in 1873. And we are following two people who become sort of somewhat involved in this trial. One is a widowed Scottish housekeeper who, along with the rest of England, becomes really obsessed with this crime and follows it really closely in the news. And the other person we follow is a star witness who grew up enslaved on a plantation in Jamaica. And this says it's based on real historical events. The Fraud is a dazzling novel about how in a world of hypocrisy and self-deception, deciding what's true can prove a complicated task. I love books that have an element of crime at their heart. I also love books that have, you know, more than one perspective. So I feel like this could be a real win for me, and it's been a while since I've read a Zadie Smith novel, so I'm very excited about this one. The next one is The Outcast by Zadie Jones. Again, this one is over 400 pages. I'm very happy about this. So I read Amy and Lan from this author last year and I pretty much loved it. I thought the ending was a little bit weak, which stopped me giving it 5 stars, but I really loved it. I wanted to go back and read the rest of her novels. Quite a lot of her novels have quite low ratings on Goodreads, but I'm still interested in reading them all. This is the one I would like to go to next. It has fairly good reviews, but also it is historical fiction. It says it's a powerful portrait of unexpected love and treacherous charades against the backdrop of a sleepy post-war English village. So I really like books that are in the interwar period, and I also really like books that are set post-World War II. This is set in 1957. This actually opens in August, so it opens in the summer, but I think quite quickly gets into the colder months. And it opens with a man who has just been released from jail, and he gets off a train and arrives in Surrey, where he's from. And it says, a decade earlier, tragedy tore his family apart, leaving him to a troubled adolescence without a mother and with a father he barely knows. The only person who understands him is Kit, who is the daughter of a bullying local businessman. It says, as family, love, passion, sex and violence become ever more so entwined, can Kit and Lewis find their way back to each other amidst the chaos. Based on reviews, I think this one is quite tragic, but it's absolutely fine with me. I loved the level of description in Amy and Lan. 100% recommend it as a book to read in the colder and cosier months. And I just can't wait to sort of just seep into her writing. I thought it was absolutely beautiful. The next one is Haweswater by Sarah Hall. I've had a mixed response to Sarah Hall's books. Some I've loved, for example, The Wolf Border, another book I would highly recommend reading in the colder months. And some I've been a bit unsure of. Even the ones I've been unsure of, I think her writing is absolutely beautiful. If you like descriptive writing, then 100% read Sarah Hall. But in a couple of her books I've read, I felt that the plot has been lacking, even if the writing itself has been beautiful. But I really like the sound of the plot in this one, and this has pretty good reviews. This is actually a shorter novel. It's around just under 300 pages. It says, in a remote dale in a northern English county, a centuries-old rural community has survived into the mid-1930s almost unchanged. But then a man drives in from the city. He's a spokesman for Manchester Waterworks, and he is saying that the whole dale needs to be evacuated so that they can make a reservoir that will supply water to the Midlands. And then a local woman sort of gets involved and I think tries to stop this happening. It says, told in luminous prose with an intuitive sense of period and place, Haweswater remembers a rural England that has been lost for many decades. I also love reading books set in rural parts of England, and again, they're books I tend to read more in the autumn and winter. So a book that's set in a rural location, also historical, is like absolute perfection in terms of comforting reading for me. The next 3 books all, I think, sound a bit more violent than the previous books I've mentioned. These 3 books also happen to be written by men, so I don't know what that says about men writing historical fiction, or at least my tastes in the type of books men write in historical fiction. That was very convoluted. The first one is The Gallows Pole by Benjamin Myers. I read and loved The Offing by this author last summer, and then I also read The Perfect Golden Circle, which I didn't enjoy as much, but I still thought it was beautifully written. I've wanted to read The Gallows Pole since it came out, but I have been putting it off because it's a book I've been wanting to listen to on audio and read along, and that's something I just need to make a bit more time for. My reasoning for that is that this book, I'm pretty sure, is set in Yorkshire, but it is a historical novel, and so I think the way they speak will be very specific and not a language I can an accent I can imagine in my head. But the reason I want to read the book alongside that is because his writing is so beautiful that I sort of really like to see it laid out on the page as well. This sounds so interesting. I think this is a real life case that happened. So there was this guy, he lived in a remote moorland location, and he got together a gang of weavers and land workers to embark upon what became a criminal enterprise that capsized the economy and became the biggest fraud case in British history. And that was that they started to clip coins, which is a treason, and it is a crime punishable by death. And this officer started to basically look into them and tried to capture them all. It says, forensically assembled, the gallows pole is a true story of resistance and a rarely told alternative history of the North. This has also been adapted into a TV show directed by Shane Meadows, who's one of my favourite directors. So I want to read this book and then watch that show because I've seen the trailer for it and it looks great. So I have really high expectations for this one, hoping to love it. And then another one that also has a TV show that I want to watch after reading the book is The North Water by Ian McGuire. Now, when this book came out, I had no real interest in reading it. I heard people talk about it. I think it was longlisted, maybe even shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And so it was a book I heard about a lot. Sort of also always had sort of at the back of my mind, but was never super keen to pick it up. But then I think in the last few months I heard Chris over at Chris Bookish Cauldron talk about it and really rave about it. He said that it is like incredibly horrible in terms of the violence within it, but that it is like an amazing book and really sort of beautifully written. And so I thought, do you know what? I want to give this a go. And also I saw that it'd been made into a TV show with a few actors in that I really liked in other things. So I want to read the book before I can watch it. This is set in 1859 and it's set on board a whaling ship that is bound for the Arctic Circle. I have realised in the last year or so that I really enjoy books set on boats. I think my reason for that is that it's really interesting to see people in like a confined location. It can get quite claustrophobic, both in terms of just physically feeling claustrophobic, but also in terms of the inability to get away from people, and so tensions start to build. And then also I love the fact that they're so affected by the weather. So these books tend to feel more appropriate for the colder and darker months because, you know, life at sea tends to be pretty brutal. And so, yeah, this sounds really interesting. Again, I'm realising how many books I'm including that have some element of a crime in them. So again, something I definitely like reading about, in particular reading about in the colder and darker months. So I think there's sort of two main characters in this. One is a man who left the British Army with his reputation in tatters. And so he accepts the position of ship surgeon on this boat, although he doesn't really want to be on it. But then they get really deep into the journey and a cabin boy is killed and the surgeon has suspicions about who may have committed this crime. And so it becomes this really scary, horrible, close quarters story. I think this is going to be really bleak and really dark, so we'll see if I can cope with it. But I am very intrigued since I saw Chris sing the praises of this book. And then this last one is one that I've had on my TBR again since it was longlisted. Was it also shortlisted for the Booker? It may have been. And then I think another one of this author's novels was also longlisted for the Booker, and I also like the sound of that one, but I'm going to start with this one. And that is His Bloody Project by Graham McRae Burnett. Again, I think this has a crime at the heart of it. This is really interesting. This one is presented as though it is a historical book about the author's ancestors, which I think is really interesting. So this opens in 1869. It says a brutal triple murder has happened in a remote community in the Scottish Highlands, and a young man, Roderick McRae, is arrested for it. This is a memoir written by the accused that makes it clear that he is guilty, but it falls to the country's finest legal and psychiatric minds to uncover what drove him to commit such merciless acts of violence. I really like books that, instead of being a whodunit, are a whydunit. which is what I've heard this book does. I've also heard this is really beautifully written in a rural location, and also I think this talks about a really interesting part of Scottish history when there were lots of disputes to do with the land rights of crofters, which is something I've read about briefly in a couple of other books and find really interesting, so something that I would happily read more about. And the last historical book I have, which I've incorrectly labelled historical fiction at the start of this video, is The House Opposite by Barbara Nobel. I really like that title. I read Doreen by this author, which was about a young girl who was evacuated out of London during the Blitz, and she is sent to live in the countryside, and it's about the time she spends there. A really cosy book that I think is good to read, probably at any time of year actually. I think some of that takes place during the summer. This one is set in London during the Blitz. We follow a young woman called Elizabeth, who's a secretary, and she's having an affair with her married boss. And we follow the group of people around her and how they're dealing with the Blitz. For example, her father is an air raid warden, and her mother is turning to drink to, get some courage to live during the air raids. And Elizabeth slips out during the air raids, and she's using this soldier for cover to hide her affair. It says, in this riveting drama of life during the Blitz, the extraordinary immediacy and vivid intimate details stem directly from the first-hand experiences of Barbara Nobel, who lived and worked in London throughout the war. The result is a unique social document and an unforgettable reading experience. In all honesty, I'll list the name of the publisher of this book here. There are lots of books from this publisher, as well as from Persephone, about the both World War I and World War II and the interwar years that I'm very interested in reading. I probably could have done a whole TBR of those books alone. So I had to cut quite a few of those books off this list because, a lot of the books were just ending up sounding too similar, and I didn't want to not enjoy them because I was reading too many similar books at the same time. But I would highly recommend you go and check out both those publishers if you like books like this one. Then I have a couple of fantasy books that also happen to sort of be like historical fiction, so I thought I'd mention them here. I tend to enjoy reading fantasy more again in the colder and cosier months, so I'd like to think I'd read more fantasy than just these two, but I just don't want to be too ambitious and then fail. So firstly, I would like to read the Warlord Chronicles trilogy. The first book is The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. I haven't read any of his books. Obviously, he's known as being a historical fiction writer. I think he's written a lot of standalones, but also a lot of series. And this is a historical fiction series that is a retelling of Arthurian legend. I've seen lots of people who love high and epic fantasy really praise this book. I think I will probably audiobook it and read along with it, again, because I will probably be really rubbish at following not only the accent, but how to pronounce a lot of the names. So yeah, this book basically starts the story of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and the trilogy follows that story to the end. And it is supposed to just be really great if you enjoy political fantasy, which I 100% do. And I also like the idea of giving a lot more detail to this legend. So very excited to read that one and just really hoping to enjoy it and want to just speed through the trilogy. And the next one is Doomsday Book by Connie Willis. I've heard Harriet talk about this book. I'll try and find the video where she reviewed it and link it above. Harriet did have mixed feelings about this one because I think it is very long, but I am still interested in this one. I think it sounds like a book I could really enjoy. This is over 600 pages. In this book, this group of scientists have created a time machine, and they intend to send somebody back to the 14th century to look at one of the deadliest eras in human history. But what happens is when they send this woman back, something goes wrong and she loses connection with the people in the present day, and she's also unsure if she'll be able to get back to the present day. So it's about her adapting to her life there, and her also trying desperately to fit in and have enough knowledge of the time period to understand the politics and the way she's supposed to act. And yeah, I just think it sounds really interesting. I think it's got a lot of historical detail, and I think that's what some people criticise about it, that it's maybe a bit too slow and plotless, but I just feel like there's a chance I could really enjoy this book. There's also a chance I could not at all, but definitely willing to give it a go. And then I have a couple of children's books I want to talk about. This first one is the third book in a trilogy, but I would highly recommend reading the whole trilogy in the autumn and winter because they're really cosy books with like a spooky edge to them. The one I'm going to read is The Vanishing of Aveline Jones, but the first book in the trilogy, which has a super autumnal cover and is set during the autumn, is The Haunting of Aveline Jones. The premise of each of these books is Aveline is on holiday from school, and in the first book she goes to stay with her aunt during Halloween, and she starts to research like a local spooky legend. In the second book she goes on a holiday with her mother, it's the summer, and again she starts to investigate this local sort of spooky thing to do with witches. And in this third book she's again gone on a holiday, and her and a friend she has made are investigating some local burial mounds that seem to have this sort of dark and spooky past to them. I love these books. When I'm reading them, I'm really enjoying them, but I'm also thinking of how much I would have absolutely obsessed over these books when I was the age range for these books, which is like 9 to 12. They're so sort of cozy and but also spooky and just really compulsively readable. So yeah, I'd really recommend these books. I really enjoy them and really excited to read the third one. And then the next book is Layla and the Blue Fox by Kieran Millwood Hargrave. This is illustrated by Tom DeFreston. I previously read Julie and the Shark by this author, and this is published in the same type of format. I really enjoyed that. I thought that was so cosy. In this one we follow a fox as she makes this really long journey across the Arctic, and we also follow Layla, who is on a journey to find the mother she thought she'd lost. I thought that Julie and the Shark dealt really well with issues of grief and difficulties children might have in understanding sort of adult problems. And yeah, I think this book will do exactly the same, and I'm sure will be just as beautiful. Then I have a couple of short story collections. Short story collections I don't think tend to be that seasonal, but I haven't read as many short story collections as I'd like to this year. So I had a little look through my list and thought, are there any that sound like they would be better to read this time of year? And found a couple that definitely would, like especially this first one. So the first one is Nobody Gets Out Alive by Lee Newman. And this one is entirely set in Alaska. And this is a collection of dazzling, courageous stories about women struggling to survive, not just grizzly bears and charging moose, but the raw, exhausting legacy of their marriages and families. It says in the title story, Nobody Gets Out Alive, newly married Katrina visits her hometown of Anchorage and blows up her own wedding reception by flirting with the host and running off with an enormous mastodon tusk. In Howl Palace, great title, an ageing widow struggles with a rogue hunting dog and the memories of her 5 ex-husbands while selling her house after bankruptcy. So yeah, all of these stories sound really good. I love that they're all set in Alaska. This is one I'll probably read in the winter. And the next one is a collection of short stories by lots of different authors. I don't read enough books like this because what I love about books like this, whether they're short story collections or essay collections, they give you a chance to sample an author's work and see if there's somebody you'd like to continue reading. So this book is Peach Pit, 16 Stories of Unsavoury Women. This is edited by Molly Llewellyn and Crystal Buckley. And this says it's a stunning anthology of fierce and dangerous women featuring stories from Lauren Groff, Deesha Philyaw, Kay Ming Chang and 13 other award-winning and best-selling authors. In these 16 stories, we see women at their most monstrous as con artists and murderers, cutthroats and scalpers, ruled by ambition and grief and spite. Characters for those tired of being told to play nice, dressed to the nines and morally grey, the stories in this anthology comprise an envelope full of teeth, each one distinct, unsettling and sharp enough to rip out a throat. And I'm looking now at the full list of authors. A couple of them I haven't heard of, but a few of them I've read books from, and a few of them I've been interested in books they've written. So we'll be very intrigued to read their short stories and see if their writing style works for me. And the next couple of books are books from Indigenous writers who I've previously read books from and really enjoyed. And so I didn't know either of these authors had books coming out, and I just stumbled across them and was so happy to see that they had new books out. The first one is And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This one's out in the next week or so. I read her essay collection, thought it was great, and yeah, can't wait to read a novel from this author. It says, this is haunting and surreal, and it will have you questioning reality alongside the protagonist as she grapples with motherhood, being a writer, a wife, and feeling like an outsider in her own life. We follow this woman who's just had a new baby. It says that she should be really happy with her life, Her husband is this ever-charming white academic whose area of study is conveniently her own Mohawk culture, and he's nothing but supportive. And they've moved into a new home in a wealthy neighbourhood in Toronto, which was a generous gift from her in-laws. But she can't stop feeling like an imposter, which is made worse by her struggle with her daughter after recently losing her own mother. She's trying to hide her despair from her husband's and their picture-perfect neighbours, among whom she's the sole Indigenous resident. It says that her perpetual self-doubt hinders the one vestige of her old life she has left, writing a modern retelling of the Haudenosaunee creation story. And then strange things start happening. Alice finds herself hearing voices she can't explain and speaking with things that should not be talking back to her, all while her neighbour's passive aggression begins to morph into something far more threatening. It says Alice suspects that something is very, very wrong and that her creation story holds the key to her and her daughter's survival. She just has to finish writing it before it's too late. I think this will be really great. Yeah, can't wait to read this one. This next one I am beyond excited about because I had no idea this author had a new book coming out, and I also had no idea that this book was going to be a follow-on from her previous books. This book is The Circle by Catherine Vermette. So a few years ago now, this author released The Break, which was a novel about a group of Métis women, and it followed this sort of brutal attack on a young girl within their family, and there was a sort of myriad of voices you followed around this attack to try and find out precisely what happened, but all the ways in which these women were linked to one another. And it's an incredibly upsetting book with a lot of triggering content because it deals with a lot of sort of intergenerational trauma, but it also, whilst being a very depressing book in some ways, felt very joyous and uplifting because these women deeply care for one another and love one another. And then The Strangers followed some of the sort of secondary characters from that book, and The Strangers followed a mother, her mother, and her two daughters at different points in their lives, and again built this story of intergenerational trauma, and I thought was really effective at illustrating what life is like for a lot of Métis women in Canada, and you know, makes you really think about how it is so easy to judge people for decisions they appear to have made in their lives when a lot of times they don't have much control over their own lives. The Circle is continuing to follow the characters from The Strangers, so I'm not sure at this point whether this book you would be able to read as a standalone. You could read The Strangers as a standalone. So I'm not going to tell you what the plot of this one is about because I don't want to spoil like who the characters are and like what their link is to The Break. But what I will say is that it says The Circle is told from various perspectives with an unforgettable voice for each chapter. The novel is masterfully structured as a restorative justice circle where all gather, both the victimised and the accused, to take account of a crime that has altered the course of their lives. It considers what it means to be abandoned by the very systems that claim to offer support, how it feels to gain a sense of belonging, and the unanticipated cost of protecting those you love most. So my guess, based on that, is that this book will feature characters both from The Break and The Strangers and pull them all together, which will be amazing. I cannot wait. This could be my book of the year. So I can't get hold of this one. Like, I would have ordered this one as soon as I found out about it, but this has only been published in Canada at the moment and I cannot find a way to get it shipped to the UK. So I'm going to have to go in some of my local indie bookshops and see if they have any way of ordering it here. So fingers crossed. This next one I just stumbled across when I was looking on my library's online catalogue. This is a book they'd recently purchased. I saw the title, I saw the cover, and I thought, this sounds like a book for me. And as soon as I read the blurb, I was like, 100% have to save this book to read in the autumn. And that is Salt and Skin by Eliza Henry Jones. This book is about a mother who is a photographer and her two teenagers who arrive in the Scottish Northern Isles. Cannot wait to read this, just based on the location alone, to make a new life. It says, everywhere the past shimmers to the surface, the shifting landscapes and wild weather dominates, the line between reality and the uncanny seems thin here. I love the word uncanny. The teenagers forge connections, making friends of the neighbours, discovering both longing and dangerous compulsions, but their mother, fallible, obsessive, distracted, comes up hard against suspicion. The persecution and violence that drove the island's historic witch trials still simmers today in isolated homes and church buildings and where folklore and fact intertwine. a compelling and magically immersive novel about a family on the edge and a community ensnared by history that gathers to an unforgettable ending. Whoever wrote that blurb, deserves a raise, because that sounds absolutely brilliant. And the next one is another one I saw that my library had purchased. I will probably save this one to be like a winter read, and that is Stolen by Anne Helen Lastadius. I apologise if I said that incorrectly. This opens as a coming of age story. This is the story of a young Sami girl coming of age in a powerful fable about family, identity and justice. 9-year-old Elsa lives just north of the Arctic Circle. She and her family are Sami, Scandinavia's indigenous people, and they make their living herding reindeer. Elsa witnesses a man who brutally kills her reindeer calf, but she doesn't report it to the Swedish police force because she doesn't trust them, and so she continues to carry this with her. It says she comes of age fighting 2 wars, one within her community where male elders expect young women to know their place, and the other against the ever-escalating wave of prejudice and violence against her people. It says when she finds herself the target of the man who killed her reindeer calf all those years ago, something inside of her finally breaks. The guilt, fear and anger she's been carrying since childhood come crashing over her like an avalanche, which will lead Elsa to a final catastrophic confrontation. I feel like this could be really brilliant in terms of the landscape it's set in. I haven't read anything about this group of people. I don't think I've even come across a book talking about them before. Please feel free to give recommendations if you've read other books like this one. And of course, I love any coming of age narrative. So yeah, I think this one sounds amazing. And then these final 2 are set in the future. The first one is Moon of the Turning Leaves, which is a follow-up to Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. Moon of the Crusted Snow was a novella. This one's over 300 pages, and my only criticism of Moon of the Crusted Snow was that I thought it was a bit too short. So the premise of Moon of the Crusted Snow is that a remote Indigenous community on a reservation in Canada lose connection. They lose satellite connection, they lose cell signal, and they don't know what's happened. And they think initially, oh, it's just a power cut, but none of these connections come back. Eventually they realise that something must have happened out there in the wider world, and so they prepare to stock resources and look after themselves. But when 2 of the young men from the community return to them on snowmobiles, a white man who is heavily armed follows them to the reservation, and it is about the push and pull of this community deciding whether they should welcome outsiders or whether, based on the history of their interaction with white Canadians, they should protect themselves and remain independent. It is an incredibly tense book. I love the way the stories of the people living in the community were written, and was really happy to see there was going to be a follow-up. So I'm not going to tell you about the follow-up, just to say that I think it is set several years later. Yeah, I can't read you the blurb because it pretty much spoils what happens at the end of Moon of the Crusted Snow. I'm really happy to see there's a follow-up. Again, I listened to this on audio. The narrator was really great, so I'd recommend these ones on audio. And then the last book is a debut novel, that's Landscapes by Christine Lee. This is published by an indie press, $2 Radio in the US, who published lots of really interesting titles. A lot of their books verge on sort of speculative or surrealism. It's set in the near future in a world fraught with ecological collapse. It brilliantly explores memory, empathy, preservation and art as an instrument for recollection and renewal. This is set on a country estate in the English countryside. It's being compared to The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I loved, so I'm very happy to hear that. We follow a woman who is cataloguing all the library books in this country estate to try and retain knowledge for the future, because they are having to sell the country estate and it's going to be demolished. But as her and her partner are archiving all these books and waiting for the estate to be demolished, his brother arrives back on the scene. And it says she suffered a brief but violent relationship 22 years before with him. It says, as his visit looms, Penelope finds herself unable to suppress the past, and she clings to art as a means of understanding, of survival and of reckoning. And it says, Landscapes is a spellbinding blend of narrative, essay and diary that reinvents the pastoral and the country house novel for our age of catastrophe, and announces the arrival of an extraordinarily gifted new writer. That sounds amazing. Again, this is sort of a twist on those type of rural historical books I like, but like set in near future. So I think that all sounds really interesting, and yeah, just can't wait to read this one. I feel even more excited about this list now than I was previously. Let me know if you have read any of these books. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them, whether they're positive or negative, as long as there aren't any spoilers, of course. And yeah, also I'd be interested in if you've read any of these books, whether you read them physically or whether you listened to them on audio, because there's a lot of these books that I'm like unsure which way to go. And yeah, I'd also like to know if you like the sound of any of these and if you plan to read them. And also if you have any books like that sound similar that you think I'd be interested in. Love to know that as well. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.